that's one of the reasons that Augustine inspires a modern, really radical Christian like Giles, because Augustine is accommodating that sense of, when we mention evil, then it's something that we can say, oh, that makes, that's not really what, we don't relate to that in the psyche. But if we relate it to maybe more like the death drive or depression or the things that take us out of life, right? And that's really what the death drive is. It's things that take us out of life. And Augustine he really describes his early life as that to us in a certain way. And Augustine is able to take those forces, those energies, and to raise them up.
I have a question.
And in a way, we saw, if those of us who read the Oresteia, we saw that as well there, that the Furies in the city, there are these potentially extremely dangerous forces. What do? You incorporate them into the city. So also Augustine. What do you do with these forces of the psyche, which are associated with death? You incorporate them into the psyche. You make it, so it's a very, very complicated notion of human psychology. And I brought up the Manicheans just to see, well, the Manicheans don't allow for that. You're either good or you're bad, right? A lot of people who claim to be monotheists and Jewish or Islam, Muslim or Christian are really Manichean, because they don't accept what Augustine accepts, which is the raw matter of the psyche, which is always resisting good. It's always part of good. It's on the same continuum of good. But when in religious worlds where people like to see things in black and white and good and evil,
I'm just going to say black
well, yeah, those are they're Manicheans essentially. Yeah. So Yuval, you had a question a minute ago.
Yeah. So what exactly does he define as evil? Like, is it people like stealing, or is it just something completely different?
So we have to think about what that means for Augustine. I mean, Itamar raised the question of law in relationship to Christianity in general. And even though the spirit fulfills the law and Christianity fulfills Judaism, there still is some kind of law or a moral law. Augustine knows what's right and what's wrong. That's for sure. That's for sure, right? He does know what's right and what's wrong. And evil is, I don't know if we want to just talk about it as transgression, as not doing the right thing. And we don't also just want to talk about evil as this kind of metaphysical idea. But evil for Augustine, I think, is I don't know. I mean, how do you account for evil in the world? And for Augustine, I think to some extent, there's the evil is intrinsic, that sense of fallenness. But I know you didn't answer your question, Yuval. We'll have to see. I mean, I'm teaching Paradise Lost now in my second year class, and Paradise Lost is really a book about this question: what is evil? What is it, and how does it exist?
Is this? I'm also not sure. The same with Yuval's question. Is it dependent on how we characterize evil? Like if we're measuring evil against law and society and the rules.
We're not doing that. We're not doing that. We're not talking about
measured
that.
Against something else.
We're wondering if there is a thing, and I don't know. We're not just talking about a social construct. That makes it easy, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We're wondering why is there suffering in the world? Why? I mean, that's another way of asking the question, right? Why does God allow suffering? If God is God, if God is good, then why does God allow suffering? The Manicheans are so blown away by that question that they say there's another force in the universe. They actually, as they say in the world of the Jewish House of Study, they go with the kasha. They don't even try to answer it, right? They say you're right. Their suffering is so God can't be. The existence of evil makes it necessary to posit an independent force of evil in the world. Sounds foreign to us, but in a way, it is the way most people think and act, and the way most bad religious leaders represent themselves. Anyway, Yalla. So that's a little bit of the background to Augustine and the Manichean context. But let's read some of Augustine. I was also telling you, I think, in my email to you that part of what I do in the program is we have a creative nonfiction program, a creative writing program, in which we teach how to write memoir. And one of the most important things a memoir writer can do, there are really two aspects to writing a memoir. You have to be present in the past and present in the present, right? You need both to be present to that past in an honest and genuine way, and you have to be present to the person who you are at the moment. If you're only present to, I mean, because memoirs can tend to be very preachy, right? That's a bad memoir. A bad memoir is preachy because all we get is the person at the end of the road. We don't see the struggle, right? In a really good memoir, and Augustine provides the ingredients for that, we feel, not only do we hear about the struggle, we participate in the struggle. We are part of the struggle. And we see the experience of the person in their past, and also we understand the perspective by which they're looking back at the past. And they might be saying, often they aren't saying, I was a totally different person in that past. But a good memoir is one in which you recognize that totally different person as your own. So Augustine does that. We always start with, in our classes, we always start with Augustine. And we read Joan Didion, we read all the great memoir writers, and we start with St. Augustine, which is kind of weird. Okay, so let's see. So let's read a bit of this. So here's Augustine really talking about voice, and he's wondering really how he is going to have a voice or find a voice, meaning how is he going to speak? And Augustine, really, we have to not keep on repeating it, because there really is no individual in the Western tradition like Augustine until Augustine. I mean, Paul is this very powerful reader, but Augustine is really wondering about and providing the language that we now have and share a voice. How shall I call upon my God and my Lord? For when I call on him, I ask him to come into me. And what place is there in me into which my God can come? How could God, the God who made both heaven and earth, come into me? Is there anything in me, O Lord, my God, that can contain thee? Do even the heaven and the earth which thou hast made and which thou didst make me contain thee? Is it possible that, since without thee nothing would be which does exist, thou didst make it so that whatever exists has some capacity to receive thee? Let's just read that again. Is it possible that, since without thee nothing would be which does exist, because of that you made it so that whatever exists has some capacity to receive thee? Why then do I ask thee to come into me, since I also am and could not be if that were not in me? Whoa, what's he saying here? Therefore, let's continue the yellow part. Therefore, I would not exist. I would not be at all unless I exist in thee, from whom and by whom and in whom all things are. You see, he's really like, he's on a guilt trip with these incredible logical mechanisms at his disposal. Even so, Lord, even so, where do I call thee to when I am already in thee? Or from whence wilt thou come into me? Where beyond heaven and earth could I go that there my God might come to me? He who hath said, I fill heaven and earth. Whoa, what's going on in this guy's head?
Professor Kolbrenner, I have
Yeah.
a question.
Yeah.
Is this not going back to the belief of the Holy Spirit, and that, like, after Christians are baptized, the Holy Spirit enters them, and then they know what the will of God is and what their purpose is?
I guess I wouldn't have thought of that doctrinal stuff. I mean, maybe that's the background for it. I'm much more interested in the psyche here, though. What is he trying to? What is he grappling with?
That God can't be contained what he's created, so he can't be in Augustine in literal sense.
Right? He can't, but then he also entertains that. He's really thinking about, well, who am I in my relationship to God? If I'm separate, and this is part of Augustine's problem, if I'm separate, well, that's a big problem, because then there's God. Elney, are you like in a witness protection program?
I was just a light here.
You're not gonna change your voice. You filter your voice so we don't know who it is. Sorry, that just caught my attention a little bit. So on the one hand, he's thinking, well, maybe God and I are separate, in which case that's problematic. But there's an other problem that Augustine has. What if everything is God? If everything is God, then God doesn't allow Augustine himself to have a voice. I think he says that. Oh, wait a minute, well, let's see. Why then do I ask thee to come into me, since I also am and could not be if thou wert not in me? Oh, so he simultaneously saying God is in me, but he still feels the lack of the divine presence. I would not be at all unless they exist in thee, from whom and by whom and in whom all things are. I think there are a couple of problems here. One is Augustine doesn't feel part of God. The other is he worries that if I am part of God completely, then I become nothing. Then I have no voice. I can't speak. I think at the very beginning, did we skip a little bit of it?
Why does he say that God would not make anything that has no capacity to receive God?
I think that's a form of wishful thinking there at this point. I'm not sure. I think he's dramatizing this conflict of uncertainty, and he's not really sure. And once philosophers hit the scene again in the 17th century, after they've been sleeping for 2,000 years, they're going to make this kind of conversation really even more complicated, because they'll say, what are you talking about, the relationship between the divine and the material? We can see with our microscopes, we can see with our telescopes, we can see the difference between a material world, a world that's material and a world that's not, or we can't even see that non-material world. But they will insist that there's a huge difference between the material and the non-material, between the spiritual and the physical. And Augustine here as a Christian is wondering, what is my place in relationship to this divine eternal being? Is there a place for the human in relationship to it? So, we may know this from our own religious traditions, maybe not. I don't know if anybody talks about this the way that Augustine does in any tradition. Right, here's chapter 6, right? I'm just skipping along here. Still, dust and ashes as I am, allow me to speak before thy mercy. Give me my voice. As we'll see, so much of the Confessions is about speaking and writing and memory and reading. I would say writing, memory, and reading. Or voice and voice. Still dust and ashes as I am, allow me to speak before thy mercy. Give me a voice. Allow me to speak, for behold, it is to thy mercy that I speak, not to a man who scorns me. What does Augustine do for a living? He ran the falafel stand at the Tachana Merkazit in Renana. Anyone?
He's a bishop, isn't he a bishop?
No, before he becomes a bishop. What?
Something to do with rhetorics,
Oh,
right?
something to do with rhetoric.
Yeah, he's a rhetoric.
He teaches rhetoric.
Yeah.
How does he relate to his previous or sometimes current life as a teacher of rhetoric? Meaning he's teaching people how to speak and teaching people how to speak, as we talked in relationship to Aristotle and the Sophists. He's teaching people how to speak, to learn the arts of persuasion, to be influential in a political realm, right? And he gets good money for it. Why do people want to learn rhetoric? Because that's business school and law school combined, right? And he does that in the language of Greek. And he's very clear about the distinction between what he's doing and what he's doing now and what he did in the past. And Augustine is interested in all the things we mentioned earlier, but also very interested in the idea of language. What can language do? What does language do? And we see him reflecting on language when he talks about his past self as a teacher of rhetoric. What are the uses of language? And rhetoricians, especially the vulgar ones, use rhetoric as a means of just persuasion. You could even say that rhetoric, and Augustine says as much, rhetoric is a form of seduction. it's a way of getting you to do something away from who you really are. And this is the real innovation for Augustine, is that he thinks that there's a sacred kind of language as well. That there's that language, the language of seduction, of political influence only, of money only, of play only. You see, he refers to play several times in this text, not in a good way. There's another kind of language as opposed to that language of play. That language which only serves the interest of men. And we'll see also the way in which, I hope maybe you already heard and maybe we'll hear the way Augustine in some ways is adopting a Platonic worldview in arguing that there's certain kinds of language which is okay, and there's certain kind of language which is rhetorical, or as he says, associated with fiction, poetic fictions, right? Anyway, so we'll come back to this emphasis on language and reading as well. So he continues, yet perhaps even thou mightest scorn me, but when thou dost turn and attend to me, thou wilt have mercy upon me. For what do I wish to say, O Lord my God, but that I know not whence I came hither into this life and death? Or should I call it death and life? I do not know. Right? As you read like 3 lines carefully, and he sounds like somebody who was writing in the most desolate and dark times of the 20th century, right? Think of like philosophical existentialists, if you know them, Jean-Paul Sartre, Albert Camus, people who just meditated on existence. And that's what Augustine is doing 2,000 years ago. What is this world that I'm in? Right? He accommodates those doubts. He's expanding the bandwidth of the soul. Let's see what else I have here. Sorry about this. I'm just looking for my pages here. Did I just skip a lot? Oh, there's Dustin Asher. Oh, that's the wrong one. I have 2 Augustines open and I just closed the wrong one. Okay. No. Okay. Oh, this is interesting also. Okay, ready? So here he's meditating on infancy. Is anybody a double psychology major? No one? So the most famous, the most well-known and influential psychologist of early life is this guy named D.W. Winnicott from the 50s and 60s. And he talks a lot about the relationship between the infant and his mother, and about how that moment of separation from the mother is the moment of identification, of self-identification, right? The infant sees himself as being one with the person, and she doesn't even have that status of separate personhood. She's just an extension of him. They're one being. And then at that moment of weaning, that's the crisis of self, when the self has to pull back and see itself as something distinct. And Augustine talks about this. And he's talking about his mother. He talks about a lot in this book. Thus, even though they sustain me by the consolation of woman's milk, neither my mother nor my nurses filled their own breasts, but thou through them didst give me the food of infancy according to thy ordinance and thy bounty, which underlie all things. For it was thou who didst give me not to want more than thou gavest, and it was thou who gavest to those who nourished me the will to give me what thou did give. So Augustine sees every God in every aspect of the universe. And they, by an instinctive affection, were willing to give me what thou hadst supplied abundantly. You see the good of the feminine here. Their instinctive affection, they give what you have supplied abundantly. It was indeed good for them that my good should come through them, though in truth it was not from them, but by them. Augustine has a very interesting relationship with the feminine. What's the most famous line from Augustine? Bring me back to you, bring me close to you, O God, but not now. Or save me from sin, but not now. Meaning, let me enjoy the moment just for a little while longer. I want to be saved, but not now. But here is the good feminine, his mother. For it is from thee, O God, that all good things come, and from my God is all health. This is what, as I have learned, as thou hast made it abundantly clear, but by all I have seen thee give, both to me and to those around me. For at the very first, I knew, for even at the very first, I knew how to suck, to lie quiet when I was full, and to cry when in pain, nothing more. Then he goes on, and he says, later, afterward, I began to laugh, at first in my sleep, then waking. For this I have been told about myself, and I believe it. I assure you, this is the first time in Western history that anybody's writing about their infant life. Nobody would think it's the slightest bit significant, though I cannot remember it. For I see the same thing in other infants. For Augustine, it's important he doesn't remember it because everything else he writes is based on memory. But here he says he's learning it just from others. Then little by little, I realized where I was and wished to tell my wishes to those who might satisfy them, but I could not. For my wants were inside me and they were outside. That's why I mentioned Winnicott, right? That sudden understanding, whatever is fulfilling me is outside of me. And they could not by any power of theirs come into my soul. You see the relationship with sustenance and the feminine and God, this is desire for union, right? Augustine so much wants union. And he says that the union that God has with, I'm hearing little children's voices, which I'm hoping are not in my house. I'm hoping it's on Zoom. Sorry. Hold on just one second, yeah. Sorry, I'm distracted by grandchildren, who are thankfully not in the house. So this is what we were saying about Augustine, and why I mentioned that earlier, child psychologist, is that you see that Augustine he's recounting his experience of selfhood and how it came about. And it comes about through the experience of lack. And that lack is fulfilled through the mother, but he says by the mother, right? By means of the mother, but the divine is there. I mean, I'm just inviting you to see how that experience of original union, right, might be understood or thought about as a kind of metaphor for religious experience. Freud, you stop me when you want to, Freud, when he was considering one of his friends who was religious, this guy, his friend of his, comes and tells Freud that when he has a religious experience, he feels this oceanic feeling. And Freud goes with it for a while, and then he just ridicules it. He says, Freud says, that's a loss of self. When you experience that oceanic feeling, you're losing the self in God. And for Freud, that was not a position of any kind of consciousness, so therefore of no interest to him.
Professor Kobriner?
Yeah.
Would Freud share that same opinion on, I don't know if you've ever seen those priests that slay people in the spirit and then they speak in like tongues and languages?
Yeah, I mean, Freud would probably find all sorts of mysticism fall under that category, right? I mean, Freud chooses to understand religion through this friend, which is a very particular understanding. But you can see that for Augustine, when he talks about it, it's not only the experience of nursing and that oneness is not only just with his mother, it's also with God, right? And this primal linking. And he realizes that he has to differentiate, that he has to become a self, And he goes on, and this could be from a case study of that psychologist I was mentioning. And so I would fling my arms and legs about and cry, making the few and feeble gestures that I could, though indeed the signs were not much like what I inwardly desired. And then when I was not satisfied, either from not being understood or because what I got was not good for me, I grew indignant, angry that my elders were not subject to me, and that those on whom I actually had no claim did not wait on me as slaves, and I avenged myself on them by crying. You get a whole little mini drama there, right? What does the kid do to his poor parents?
Crying because he can't express any desires.
Right. So, well, I mean, there's a really story that Augustine tells. First of all, he says, well, he knows he wants to express something that he can't express. The signs were not like what I inwardly desired. It's like here, the baby Augustine is pining after language. And that's, I said, Augustine very interested in language, but he doesn't have it yet. So the only language he has is crying. And what he wants to do through his crying, think of any immature person in your life, a passive aggressive person in your life, is through their crying to turn you into their slave. Anybody know anybody like this? Has anybody ever felt like?
Aren't toddlers like this?
I
when they stamp their feet and they.
I was just asking the more personal question. If any of you have any full-grown friends who are still toddlers, or family members. How about family members? That's easier, right?
Me, like.
I'm sure that can't be the case, Nicole. You know, how do you get what you want?
Joke's on me, I guess. Yeah.
How do you get what you want? You act out, right? You pout. You turn everybody else into your slave. That's what the President of the United States was able to do through 4 terms minus 13 days. Just couldn't do it. Couldn't get those last 13 days in. Right. So here you see Augustine pining for language.
It's like all the desires are internal and being infant is miserable.
Right. I mean, but you'll see also, well, what will Augustine do when he does get language? What will he do with it? That's another question, right? So then here he contemplates this kind of non-being, I guess. And he starts here. Was it such another age which I spent in my mother's womb? For something of that sort has been suggested to me, and I have myself seen pregnant women. Okay, but what, oh God, my joy preceded that period of life? Augustine asks those questions that you ask at like 3 o'clock in the morning when you can't sleep and you try to think of something else. That's what Augustine is writing about, right? What was I before I was? Augustine, and we didn't even read this part, spends a whole book of this book called Confessions, talking about time and eternity, and not just philosophically, experientially. No one can explain these things to me, neither father nor mother, nor the experience of others, nor my own memory. Dost thou laugh at me for asking such things, or dost thou command me to praise and confess unto thee only what I know? So this is the intimacy of the Confessions, and maybe that's part of what Augustine's language is. It's an intimate language. I think later on in the book, he praises his mother, who is not able to give out certain kind of charity, but instead she gives of her heart through words, through prayers. So here again, Augustine is giving language to something without language, and maybe that's part of what he does later in terms of prayer. Let's see. Okay. Oh, here's a good part. Let's skip over here. So here he talks a little bit about the acquisition of language. Let's take a break now, since we've been going for 45 minutes straight. Should we do that? Let's take a break. Let's take a 2.5-minute break. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mhm. Too late. No, too late also. Well, let's actually listen to that last one. I know Itamar doesn't approve, but I guess. And we're back. I just decided that I have not been listening to enough Grateful Dead during this lockdown. It just has a very sweet, I mean, it's just a different vibe than all the Mahler and Rolling Stones I've been listening to. If you're interested in listening, 77 was a good year, but their best music is from 1969 to 1973. Right, so any questions up until now about Augustine? I know we're doing a lot of kind of, we're not proceeding analytically, which may be frustrating, I acknowledge. So that's where we're stopping now. We've talked a little bit about Augustine and language, Augustine and good and evil, Augustine and sin. Let's see what else he has to talk about here. Right, so Augustine talks here about the acquisition of verbal signs. And then he goes on, and here he's going to, I think, start to talk about language. So he's freaked out by something. Oh my God, oh my God. What miseries and mockeries did I then experience when it was impressed in me that obedience to my teacher was proper to my boyhood? A state, if I was to flourish in this world and distinguish myself in those tricks of speech, which would gain honor for me among men and deceitful riches. That's kind of, what is Augustine surprised by here? He has like a rude awakening when he goes to school. What's his rude awakening?
The obedience for his teachers.
Right, he can't treat everybody like slaves, meaning his natural tendency to be an egomaniac has to be, he finds out that in order, and what he wants to achieve is to distinguish myself in those tricks of speech which would gain honor for me among men and deceitful riches. And here you can see in Augustine, and maybe it's the first time we've seen it, or we're seeing it more explicit here, that we see both his telling of the past, but also the perspective of the present. Meaning from the point of view of the present, he remembers the experience of the misery and mockery, and we feel that. And I guess we also, but we're in our present, we feel Augustine judging that former self, right? Because what was he willing to sacrifice his egotism for? For tricks of speech which would distinguish him and among men only and not God, and deceitful riches. So he encounters, again, Augustine is writing really the first autobiography. He encounters the obstacles that an adult encounters. It's like, that's, I think, the problem of adolescent. It's the adolescence. It's the infinite desires of the child sexualized, but without the perspective of the adult. Here. So now he continues talking about his past. For I do not, O Lord, lack memory or capacity, for by thy will I possessed enough for my age. However, my mind was absorbed only in play. And I was punished for this by those who were doing the same thing themselves. But the idling of our elders is called business. The idling of boys, though quite like it, is punished by those same elders. And no one pities either the boys or the men. Why? I'm not following this here. How is he being punished for the same thing that other people are being praised for or profiting from?
Can you say that again?
He says, he says, the idling of our elders is called business. The idling of boys, that very much like it, is punished. What are these two kinds of idling? Or how is the idling, the playing of boys, like what the elders are doing?
Like if the elders do it, then it's okay. But with the boys doing it, then they get punished.
Are they doing the same thing?
Perhaps it's like the adult acting like a child, you know, that because because the adult is old and mature and knows more, he can get away with childish behavior, but the child cannot.
So it's the same behavior, but it's just a different way of doing it?
Yes,
or,
we see it in...
Wait. Or is it, or any nominations for its different behavior? What are the kids doing? Let's just read the rest of it. For, will any common sense observer that I was rightly punished as a boy for playing ball? Is that what the adults are doing? Just because this hindered me from learning more quickly those lessons by means of which, as a man, I could play at more shameful games. So we should have read the rest of it, right? And did he by whom I was beaten do anything different when he was worsted in some small controversy with a fellow teacher? He was more tormented by anger and envy than I was beaten by a playmate in the ball game. So they're playing different games. So how are these different games that they're playing, how are they the same? How is playing ball the same as arguing with a fellow in the political arena, or arguing or negotiating about a deal? Yes, Elni.
Are they the same, did you say, or how they're different? Sorry.
Pardon? How are they different? Well,
No,
we're saying, yeah. How are they
no,
different?
I just didn't get the question. If you said how they're the same or how are they different?
Well, now we know they're different. One is playing ball and one is besting somebody else in the rhetorical arena. So now I'm asking how are they the same?
Perhaps
They
the
live on the same ground, same basics.
What Nicole, what do you mean by that? What do you mean same ground, same basics? So you're basically saying there's something similar about it. Well, what is that similar thing?
perhaps they share the same attitude. Like,
Oh,
whilst
wait, let me just follow up with Nicole. You were in the middle. Go ahead, Nicole. Yeah.
Because like maybe playing a ball and arguing is you have the same animosity, like, and the same like arrivalness and the same principles, like.
The same animosity, right? So, and it's even worse, Augustine seems to be saying, when it's in grown men, because his is play and their play is shameful. And shameful, I thought shameful was going to be because they're doing something lewd or something, but shameful is, what is the shame here? Do people look at you and ask you like why you became English majors? Why don't you do something like, I don't know, especially if you come from a wealthy community like I did. So people are like, why would you do that?
Why aren't you a lawyer or a
Why
doctor?
would you went to these great universities? Why would you want to not make 6 figures to start? Right. So we're Augustine, looking at the shameful people in the public sphere who are using all their linguistic skills only for profit and seduction, right? While we use language in the pursuit of truth. We are all Augustines. T-shirts. Now we can't do that at Barcelona, wouldn't go over so well, right?
Tell that to your parents.
What's that? How about that's another story. You know, it's a complicated immigrant story, right? What do you want? You know, you're the first generation who comes into America, all they want to do is make money, right? They come from the shtetl, they want to make money. Then they make money, so all they want to do is send their closest kids to school, right? Like a real university. And the third generation, well, that's me, right? That's another question. But that's for the memoir, Nicole, but thanks for asking. Devorah, I interrupted you?
it's okay. Nicole covered what I wanted to say.
Oh, she covered, good.
Yeah.
Okay, good. So,
So it's a shameful act.
it's shameful because Augustine looks, I mean, again, we're seeing things from the lens of his current perspective, the shameful games. The shameful games it's what everybody else does. Now, Augustine, remember, Augustine goes on to found a church in which he really makes a separation between the church and everything else. And when he rejects his former life as a teacher of Greek rhetoric, he's not just only rejecting that part of himself, but he's rejecting all of Greek culture. Oh, there's a part coming up right here, which I thought was good for us especially. Oopsie. So here, Augustine mentions Virgil. Here, look how he says over here. You can relate to this. In the other subjects, however, I was compelled to learn about the wanderings of a certain Aeneas, oblivious of my own wanderings, and to weep for Dido dead, who slew herself for love. And all this while, I bore with dry eyes my own wretched self dying to thee, O God, my life in the midst of things. For what can be more wretched than the wretch who has no pity upon himself, who sheds tears over Dido, dead for the love of Aeneas, but who sheds no tears for his own death in not loving thee, O God, light of my heart, and bread of the inner mouth of my soul, O power that links together my mind with my inmost thoughts. And he goes on and says, I did not love thee, and thus committed fornication against thee. Here we're encountering, Aeneas encounters himself on the walls of Carthage, and he reads himself there. And this is a very strange scene of reading. What's going on here? What is Augustine's experience of a reading about this certain Aeneas? It's like so-and-so, Ploni Almoni Aeneas. Why is that important for him?
It made him think of his own journey to where he came
So
now.
so Yuval, you're driving down the baseline. So now smash it into the slam dunk it. Go a little further with that, Yuval.
I don't know that let me think about it.
Okay. Anybody else want to? So it's an alley-oop. So Yuval threw the ball above the basket and somebody says slam dunk it. Yes, you have to let me finish the metaphor. Go ahead, yeah.
He's being taught about somebody else's journey, a certain Aeneas, instead of being taught about his own or think about, philosophize about his own journey.
Right. I mean, so it's a commentary not only on this certain Aeneas, but upon the kind of reading that doesn't really address who he is. For what can be more wretched than the wretch who has no pity on himself, who sheds tears over Dido, dead for the love of Aeneas, but who sheds no tears for his own death and not knowing thee. It's just made me think of something I was reading this morning.
That instead of weeping for Dido, he should have cared more about his journey.
Exactly. There's a great scene in Hamlet where Hamlet sees, it's obviously Hamlet is thinking of Augustine, Shakespeare's thinking of Augustine, where Hamlet, he invites these actors to come into Elsinore, right? They come into Elsinore to act, to put on a show. And Hamlet says to the head actor, who in the original production was Shakespeare, and says, put on that scene from X, Y, and Z. And the scene is the destruction of Troy and about Aeneas and Dido. And Hamlet says he sees one of the actors, or they acted out, and the actors are crying. And Hamlet says himself, that actor's crying and it's all fiction. And I can't get around to crying for my father and taking revenge. So when we read Hamlet together, hopefully we will one day, we can talk more about that. But it's, even if we don't follow through entirely, it's just important to see the way in which really great writers have read everything, and they're creating a dialogue between themselves and their own work. Shakespeare, Hamlet. So for Shakespeare, it's Hamlet, Augustine, Aeneas. And our problem right now is Augustine. And Augustine is really saying, by rejecting the story, is not just rejecting the story or even the literature, he's rejecting the whole worldview. Why read a book in which God doesn't understand me, in which I'm not being addressed, in which I'm not the star of the story? That's really what Christianity does. It takes it, or Augustine does here, is he takes every man, and he is the version of every man. And it's not Aeneas. It's not a certain Aeneas who is the star of the story. It is Augustine who's the star of the story. It's the individual who is the star of the story.
So is his journey then Christianity, while Aeneas is finding Rome?
Well, we should look through Confessions for the word empire. For Augustine, the empire is entirely his own. The only empire is an internal empire. There's no Rome, right? There's the soul. There's the soul in relationship to God. The journey is internal. Oh, right. Does Augustine do something bad in his life? Like, is there some like original sin for Augustine? Right. You see also, just go ahead. Go. What over here?
Didn't he invent the concept of original sin in the first place?
No, I think the Bible does that. I mean, I think it's happening in the Gospels. I don't know. But what I'm asking really in the story of his life that he's telling, what for him is that original sin? I mean, I first just want to note this as we're passing through here. When he's young, there's a love of play and a craving for spectacles, a stage-struck restlessness. He talks elsewhere about being tickled with lying fables. So I said earlier that Augustine is borrowing from Plato, and the same way that Plato rejects the poets and the rhetoricians by saying that they're all fables or play or images or spectacles, so Augustine is doing the same thing, but he's doing it. It's interesting that he's using the language of the Greek really to Plato, the philosopher, to reject all of Greek culture, everything. Right? So his culture will be Christian. It's another one of these very strong readers. I mean, Paul is different. Paul basically sucks Judaism into him. Augustine is more careful, and he really rejects that world of who he was. But let's now look at that original sin. Doesn't he steal some stuff? Where does he steal stuff?
Doesn't he also admit to lust? I don't remember where, but
Oh,
something about lust or love, something like that.
Well, I thought that was the whole book. I mean, the whole book is him admitting to lust. Seems like he had a very problematic adolescence. That's one of the reasons I asked you about what social media platform he would be on. If you were Augustine's parents, you would put a filter on the internet, right? He was that kind of adolescent, and that's how he tells the story. He tells that story of his sin. But no, he steals. Where does that happen? Oh yeah. Oh, here we go. He steals some pears. Ready? Let's read from the top here. Theft is punished by the law, O Lord, and by the law written in man's hearts, which not even ingrained wickedness can erase. So here you see, this is Augustine finessing Itamar's question. If there's no law, well, where is the law? The law is in your heart. For what thief will tolerate another thief stealing from him? Even if a rich thief will not tolerate a poor thief who is driven to theft by want. I guess Augustine is saying somehow we know this. Philosophers will make similar arguments, even though the law is not given to us because we don't really believe in that anymore. There is a moral law in the heart. Yet, he says, I had a desire to commit robbery and did so, compelled to it by neither hunger nor poverty, but through a contempt for well-doing and a strong impulse to iniquity. For I pilfered something which I already had in sufficient measure and of much better quality, right? I had a Hugo Boss suit and I went to Old Navy and bought one and stole 3 there. For I pilfered something which I already had in sufficient measure and of much better quality. I did not desire to enjoy what I stole, but only the theft and the sin itself. There was a pear tree, and here he really is enacting his old Garden of Eden, right? There was a pear tree close to our own vineyard, heavily laden with fruit, which was not tempting either for its color or for its flavors. That's different than the verses in Genesis. Not even that. They're not even, I'm sure you guys know the Hebrew, whatever it is. They're not even tempting to the eye. Late one night, having prolonged our games in the street until then, as our bad habit was, a group of young scoundrels and I among them went to shake and rob this tree. We carried off a huge load of pears, not to eat ourselves, but to dump out to the hogs after barely tasting some of them ourselves. Doing this pleased us all the more because it was forbidden. Such was my heart, O God, such was my heart, which thou didst pity even in that bottomless pit. Behold, now let my heart confess to thee what it was seeking thee there, when I was being gratuitously wanton. What does that mean? What does it mean to be gratuitously wanton? Go, 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 go. Everyone knows what does gratuitous mean?
Ongoing,
Mm,
and too much.
getting closer, I think. Gratuitous is, I see what you mean by ongoing, but I wouldn't say that first, though. I'm sorry, what did somebody else say? I mean, is there
Do something with that without there being a need to do it.
right, completely unnecessary.
Yeah,
That cause or justification.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly, good. That cause, just completely unnecessary. But he says there is some cause. We carried off the huge lot of pears, not to eat ourselves, but to dump out to the hogs, after barely tasting some of them ourselves. Doing this pleased us the more because it was forbidden. Such was my heart. Behold, now let my heart confess to thee what it was seeking there, when I was being gratuitously wanton, having no inducement to evil, but the evil itself, it was foul, and I loved it. Right? I loved my own undoing. I loved my error, not for that which I erred, but the error itself, a depraved soul, falling away from security in thee to destruction of itself, seeking nothing from the shameful deed, but shame itself. You know, if you want, I used the term before, Freud's idea of the death drive. Well, here it is, right? I loved my error. I loved the error itself, a depraved soul falling into destruction, the love of destruction, right? We don't really acknowledge that so much, but there's a kind of death drive. You see it in politics often. You see it in depressed people, right? And here, what is, in reading this passage, does Augustine feel separated or in some way connected to God?
Connected, I think.
Okay, so first give us the pshat, Elmi. Give us the simple meaning, because if it's connected, it's certainly not the simple meaning, right? What's
he's talking just by the fact that he's having a conversation with God shows some sort of connection.
Oh, that's good. I didn't even think of that, right? What else? What else? So there's this story that he is, such was my heart, oh God, such was my heart. Although, right, I'm wondering when he looks back on this in the past, what does he see in that event?
There, I think he sees that God was with him, but he wasn't with God.
I mean, so he says that he's depraved. I mean, what is this? I wonder, has anybody ever experienced, now let's say, do you know anybody who's ever experienced this pleasure in doing wrong for its own sake? We don't have to think about serial murder or mass murder. You can think of other things. The transgression that is pleasure. What's the verse from Proverbs? Forbidden waters are most sweet, right? Same psychological insight there. Can we relate to this idea of embracing what is behind? I forget. We have to. It's not a therapeutic session. What is behind that idea of embracing evil for its own sake?
I think
what psychological need gets expressed through that? Yes, Deborah.
I'm not sure the psychological need, but going back to what Giles was saying about us being broken and having the capacity to commit good and evil. I think there's very much a relationship with God here, and a talking with God, saying that, you know, you created me with the ability to commit evil acts, but also with the ability to atone for those sins and to realize them and to work on being better.
The 20th century literary critic T.S. Eliot said of the French poet Baudelaire, who had a reputation in Paris of being one of the most lascivious and wanton persons in the city, Eliot said of Baudelaire that he was the most religious person in Paris. But I think what he meant by that is he was saying the same thing that Augustine is saying about himself. I mean, there are two things here. I mean, I want to go back to the first question I asked, but Devorah's answer is that, and Elney was saying this as well, that in the sense of sin is the sense of the presence of God. That the embracing of sin as sin, or depraved as depraved, I feel depraved, is already seeing yourself from God's perspective. That's if you're not a Manichean, right? If you're a Manichean, you're just bad. Augustine says, no, I'm not a Manichean, I'm a Christian. And that evil in me propels me to good. There's a very similar rabbinic notion, I'm sure many of you know it, a place where a place where a choser b'tshuva stands, a tzaddik cannot even imagine standing there. And that's the same psychological principle. A person who is very far away can get very, very close. And I think that's what Augustine is saying here, that even down in his iniquity and feeling of being depraved, he even feels the divine. But I don't think you can erase the first part, which is the sheer pleasure of just breaking the law, of doing evil. Not breaking the law, of upsetting people. Doing something that nobody would think you would do.
I don't think
Nicole, what were you saying?
No, I'm just asking, does it have to be evil, like straight up evil and so bad? Like people may make mistake that they find pleasure from, but it's not always like evil.
No, so I'm talking about a sense where you have, which Augustine claims to, I think this is part of it as well, that Augustine knows that since he feels that it's evil, that there must be a God who is giving him the conscience to make that distinction. That once I'm saying it's evil, when I say it's evil, there's already an acknowledgement of God there, because evil only exists. I think maybe it's a little bit of what you're trying to say, Nicole. Evil only exists in relationship to some kind of moral system, in this case to God. And as soon as he feels himself as evil, he even sees in that absolute narcissism the possibility for good. It's the really evil people who descend to that narcissism and they have no way out of it, right? They never get out of it. They're stuck in it.
I think he reiterates that when he says by neither hunger nor poverty. Like, you know, sometimes people commit crimes out of desperation.
Right,
and he's saying, no, this is purely evil. I didn't do this to help my family or to claim revenge on a terrible act. I did this just because it was pleasurable and I wanted to.
Did it for its own, evil for its own sake. Let's see. Yeah, somebody said something else. I'm just searching while we're talking.
Just for the sport of it.
Yeah, and I'm not so sure. It's for him. It's that it's so casual though. It's evil, which is really the pursuit of evil.
It's again some sort of a children psychology. Just as a child has troubles or separated from his mothers as the period where a child will do evil for evil's sake or wrongdoing.
Exactly.
Because it's some sort of a test.
I think part of it also is it's used as a lesson rather than it being just evil and you learn. It's a test, like Karen said, but it's also a lesson to show that you did something evil, but you're able to overcome that and become a good person.
Right. I hear you're all such good people though, but I just want to recover that sense that when he does it, there is really that sense of evil, right? I mean, the important for Augustine, and this is why he is such a profoundly good psychologist, is that he does not erase the feeling of evil, or what Giles called brokenness, right? You don't just walk away with the lesson. If you, and think about it, if you read a memoir, right? You read a memoir and a person goes through a very traumatic period in their life, but they just tell you about it from the point of view of, oh, I went through that, and look at me now. Everybody learn you've seen this, I'm sure. Learn your lesson from me. I went through that, and look at me now. And all you want to do is punch that person in the face, because you can see that they're not being honest about the journey that they went on. And you won't be surprised when 3 months later you find out when they were back in the same place. Because if you don't go through hell, you don't get to heaven. Milton writes Paradise Lost, which is about just this, and the whole book starts in hell. You have to go into hell in order to come out of it. And Augustine is saying that in psychological terms. If you want to come out of hell, you have to go into it. You can't ignore it. You can't be a Manichean. It's part of you. It's part of you. And this, by the same token, we'll have to figure out some way in which evil is part of God's creation, in which he's not responsible for it. Really, you could almost say the Manichean perspective is the Pashtut. It's the simple meaning, right? You have evil and good. And as I said, the Manicheans are so bothered by the question, how can you attribute evil to a good God, that they say you don't. There's a good God and a bad God. But Augustine, and I think it comes from his understanding of the psyche, evil is part of the person, evil is part of the creation, it just has to be transformed. But you only get to that when you read the whole book, that idea that it's been transformed, because he's extremely honest about where he's been. Maybe he's saying that evil is an opportunity given by God to. Right. I mean, I'm sorry to write you, because when we describe it, all of us, including me, it turns it more into a cliche. And that's why memoir writing is an important genre, and why it's good to write memoirs, because they're not preachy, right? When you read a good memoir and you get to the end of it, you're like, oh, something, the best, for me, the best memoir, the short piece of memoir is by James Baldwin, Notes of a Native Son. I'll send it to all of you. And he says stuff at the end that if he said at the beginning, you would say, that's just such a cliche. How could you say that? But when you get to it at the end, after the experience that he's had, it's like, oh, wow, he really earned that. He earned that. And Augustine is the beginning of a tradition in the West of really great writing, in which if there are lessons, you learn them. If we wanted lessons, we'd read the Grimm's fairy tales or whatever. We'd read The Little Midrash Says, or whatever you wanted to read, We'd read simple stories that make us feel good. But lessons, I think Augustine says at a certain point, we like to be tickled by fables. We like fables. People like fables. We like living in simple stories. But it's much harder when you try to make those stories actually accommodate not only our ideals, our ambitions of what we want to be, but who we are in the meantime. I think we'll stop now. There's one more thing I do want to talk about. Augustine talks a lot about reading, so we'll talk a little bit about that at the beginning of next class. He looks at his teacher, Ambrose, who was one of the other church fathers, and he sees Ambrose, and he's surprised because Ambrose is reading a book, but his lips aren't moving. And apparently up until that time, reading was always an oral exercise. And Augustine talks about how his teacher is reading like we do, without speaking. And Augustine notices this because he also sees that whatever is happening through the process of reading is happening internally. It's not for other people. It's yours. It's the individual's, right? So whatever dialogue there is, it's internal. Okay. I'm around for questions, but bye.
Professor Colburn.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm listening to her.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask you about Paradise Lost. I'm really interested in reading it. How
Okay.
many books is it? I'm just looking for it online. Is it one book or is it a section of books?
Well, it's like an epic, like Homer. He
It's like
models himself after Virgil, so it has 12 books.
So it has 12 books. Okay.
Mhm.
Yeah. All right. Okay. Thank you.
My pleasure.
All right,
Bye.
take care. Bye-bye.
I just wanted to say that I
Yeah.
recently started reading John Barth's Lost in the Farmhouse, and
Okay.
I did not get the reference until now of the name Ambrose.
I
I
think I read
think
that a very long. I think I read that a very long time ago. What's it about?
it's about some. I haven't finished it yet. It's like a series of stories, but 3 of them. I've only read 2.
Okay.
It's like the biography of some kid who's born with a mark on his neck. And the first story is called Ambrose, His Mark.
And what is his mark? What is his mark?
It's a little bee.
And what is it? And do you think it corresponds to anything that Augustine is writing about or seeing in Ambrose?
I just I saw that Augustine wrote Ambrose himself. So it might be connected. Also, I think the whole short story collection is about like the essence of reading.
Very cool. We'll start talking about that next time, because Augustine, his whole life changes through reading. That's the way he represents it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right. All right,
So I think it might be connected. Yeah.
Very cool. I'll see you next time.
See you.